All right, everyone. Hello, welcome back. I'm Dan. This is Dan's Astrology. Today, I'm going to be talking about Mercury retrograde. It happens to be the 1st of July, which is Canada Day. So, happy Canada Day to any Canadians in the audience. Um, First of all, what I'd like to point out about this is that today Mercury is at 5 degrees Leo, which is in an opposition to Pluto and Aquarius at 3 degrees. There is a orb, so it's already beginning to separate from the opposition to Pluto. But this is the dynamic that I am mainly focusing on today is going to be the opposition between Mercury in Leo and Pluto in Aquarius, although you will notice that there are some other aspects as well. For example, Saturn and Neptune in Aries are making a trine to Mercury. Um, so there's not only the Pluto dynamic, but also Saturn and Neptune, and all you have to keep in mind that Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius. So there's quite a lot of Saturnian energy around this one, I would say, but also combined with a very Yang kind of situation because all these aspects are happening between fire and air. Um, so I'm just going to show you exactly what this looks like. Right now, we're in a period of time known as the Mercury retrograde shadow, which is basically the lead up. It's going through a part of the zodiac where when it goes retrograde, it will have to retread these steps. So here you see the S showing up around Mercury, July 18th. It stations retrograde and goes backwards. Here we have Mercury conjoining the Sun. This is what is known as a retrograde cazimi, where Mercury will be reborn, basically. And you can see here Mercury in the first house on the other side of the Sun, meaning that after the Mercury retrograde, Mercury will start a new cycle as a morning star, meaning that Mercury will rise before the Sun. Um, Here you see the stationing direct at 4 degrees. So basically, where we're at now, we have just entered the shadow phase, and Mercury is going to be going forward through Leo, stationing retrograde, backing up, and then stationing direct on the 10th of August in this opposition to Pluto. So, and then you'll also notice that at this point in time, it'll also be repeating the trine to Saturn and Neptune, and by this time Uranus will have ingressed into Gemini, which I will remind you that Mercury is the ruler of. So by the time this Mercury retrograde is complete, we'll have Uranus in Gemini, and we'll have Mercury making aspects to the whole range of outer planets here, which makes it particularly interesting, right? To me, anyways. But so I think maybe instead of just making this about the opposition to Pluto, I can also factor in the Saturn and Neptune trine and the sextile to Uranus that will happen at the end of this Mercury retrograde. There's also, by this time, Mars will ingress into Libra and it'll be making a sextile to Mars. This is just really interesting to me because it shows, first of all, Uranus ingressing into Gemini, Mercury's sign, as a kind of a breakthrough moment. And then the ruler of Gemini is making all kinds of aspects to all kinds of planets after this retrograde is complete. And so I find this a particularly interesting Mercury retrograde cycle for that reason. And with all this in mind, I had some ideas about this, right? Before I get any further into this, I would just like to say that part of why I choose to do astrology is that there's, when you're talking about how we relate to the world around us, astrology is obviously perhaps more of or divination in general, maybe more of an intuitive practice. And for better or worse, I seem to be a highly sensitive and intuitive kind of person. However, I think when it comes to Pluto in Aquarius and this Saturn-Neptune dynamic, there's something about Pluto which usually represents for something like the shadow or the id or some kind of force of repression or maybe power, control, resentment, that kind of stuff. And there's some kind, I have to admit that I have my own kind of obstacles with practicing astrology, or that I noticed that there's certain things to do with the fact that I'll just admit that I have a mental health condition. And one of the things that people talk about with mental health condition are things like triggers or whatever, or that I think that especially like people with, let's say, bipolar or mania or stuff like that, it might not even be triggered, but they might be sort of like just more open to suggestion or more open to like subtle influences or like unconscious dynamics or something like that. And I have to admit that I have taken, for one thing, I've taken a certain style in my astrology practice of, instead of just like approaching it from mundane predictions, I tend to wax philosophical about things. And what I realized was that I think that a lot of it comes down to the fact that for some reason, I feel overly sensitive and intuitive, and I pick up things that are going on, but it doesn't seem to really have much practical connection to my own life. And I seem to just be picking up all kinds of, I'm just going to give you an example, is that I recently found out that one of my sister's longtime friends, she's known from childhood, it got pregnant. And I realized that there's something about issues such as reproduction or having children or something like that is a kind of like, it seems to trigger me into some kind of like reaction where instead of just, if I was just doing a completely mundane kind of chart, I might, say, predict something. It could be with Jupiter and Cancer, right? Because Cancer is all about the mother and, of body parts. It rules the breasts, and it has to do with babies and breastfeeding and stuff like that. I could have just said, from a very like cool, detached way that, maybe people will be getting pregnant around this, but there's something about it where the whole topic of pregnancy and raising children and parenting and all that kind of stuff. Instead, I also think it's a kind of, it's not just about like triggering unresolved trauma or something like that, but there's some kind of like unresolved bundle of energy around this. And I end up just going into some kind of like philosophical rant about it, whatever, right? I think this is basically what I'm trying to get at with Pluto in Aquarius and Mercury in Leo. I also have to admit that I was there's certain things like I was a sperm donor baby, and I'm not actually related to my biological father's family. And however, my dad was on that side of the family was an Aquarius. My grandma on that side of the family was an Aquarius. And we also had a Leo uncle. And what I've come to like kind of understand about Aquarius and Leo is that I think Leo is much more, because of the solar archetype, wants to be like the main character, wants to be the protagonist, and is very kind of open and expressive. Whereas Aquarius, as a Saturn ruled sign, is maybe more like the person who's working in the background as like a lab technician or a scientist or something like that, who may put in the hard work, but is not kind of a supportive character or something like that. And there's something about I remember growing up with my dad, the Aquarius, would often say things like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, right? And there's this kind of like idea of like that whole attitude, the omission of saying things that aren't very nice creates this kind of like buildup of Aquarian, Pluto, underworld dynamics. And there's something also about this where, as a sensitive, intuitive person or whatever, I just find that it's like there's I have a certain there's this question, maybe it's even questionable for me to do astrology, because what I find is that like when trying to collaborate with other astrologers, there's like, even if at some more like at the daylight yang level, even if I'm like enthusiastic about certain people or their work or something like that, there's like the Pluto in Aquarius, or Pluto in general, there's something about the Pluto dynamic which feels like some kind of like unconscious irritant. And it is almost a cliche where people talk about like transformation and stuff like that, that it could be that like by doing this kind of work, it puts pressure on you to transform and change yourself and do things differently. But the other thing about Pluto is it can be very kind of stubborn and rigid and fixed, in that there's certain things which are irritating precisely because they don't really lend themselves to being changed very easily. The other thing about this is that when in that whole dynamic of like what I associate with Aquarius is this kind of like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Rather than being about self-expression, it might be more about like putting on the uniform or conforming, or like. But I also think about like how you have like, oh, I don't know, what are those? I'm thinking about in England how they have those guards that are like dressed up in the uniform, and they're very like they don't show any emotion, or they don't show any expression. They just have like a stern look on their face, and they almost act like they're like robot people or something like that. There's some kind of like dynamic with that reminds me of this kind of like Pluto and Aquarius. The other thing about it too is that I have to admit, in this sort of thing about, I admittedly having whatever my mental health condition being in the realm of mania and bipolar and stuff like that, that there's something about doing. I don't want to like dwell too much on negativity, I guess you would say, but that there's something about, especially I think with Canada today, or stuff in general, that when I prefer to just make astrology videos, because I find I like hanging out in this space where, instead of focusing so much on stuff like, mental health problems that put me in a certain different category of other, there's where you're sectioned off and isolated, and like you feel like alien, and you're like, you've got this label over your head for the rest of your life. That astrology is a way where you can still play with this idea of like labels and types and categories and stuff like that, but in a way that feels less oppressive than having a mental health condition. But part of this whole thing is that I have realized that if I listen to other people with this kind of diagnosis talk about their experiences, unfortunately, there's certain things that are kind of relatable. And for me, one of those things is that when I grew up, there's a lot of, I have to count my lucky stars, in the sense that at least I had a pretty good social life when I was younger. But at some point in time, I had a falling out with a lot of my teenage adolescent friends. And when I listen to the other people who suffer from bipolar or schizophrenia or stuff like that, it seems to be a common story where there is some traumatic moment where all your childhood friendships, your in-group of social life falls apart, and you are basically left isolated and alone and bitter and resentful about things. And for me, I think Canada Day can kind of be a trigger around this, because it's a time when you see all the other people out there gathering together and celebrating and socializing and having fun, and yet I am basically have this, you feel like you're stuck, kind of doomed. Not really, I don't want to be that pessimistic, but that there's like now that you have this mark of shame and stigma on your head as being a diagnosed person, and none of your friends talk to you anymore. It just like, there's a certain kind of negativity around that, right? But the thing is, for this reason, the thing is, it's like I'm motivated not. I'm basically why I'm bringing up Pluto and why I'm bringing up Saturn and Neptune is that there's a certain element of like self-censorship around this, where like what I'm saying with this Aquarian attitude, like if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. That there's like it's better not to talk about this kind of stuff. And so even if you are upset, or even if you do have things that like bother you about your situation, it's not really socially acceptable to just like get into this stuff. So you have to basically repress this and put on like a happy face and like act cheery even though you're not. And then I think this creates this kind of split between what is considered to be like, you know, your authentic feelings, which are oppressed, versus the happy face you put on to the world for the sake of getting along, even if it's not very authentic. And I don't know, I'm just mentioning all this because I think in this whole Mercury retrograde process, there could be this sort of like irritant of these repressed things that you're not allowed to talk about, versus I think the other problem about this is that despite my, I remember I have this distinct memory of around, it was back I think 2017. I was getting my passport done to go on a trip, to go on a vacation, to go traveling. And when I was in line at the passport office, which is there's this kind of thing where it's like, since everybody has their phone, like if you're in a lineup, you can easily just kill time by like playing a game on your phone, or like scrolling on social media, or all this kind of stuff. But I tend not to do that. I tend to have a very small data plan and not use my phone very much when I'm out. And I remember this distinct, I can't remember what it was I was thinking about, but I just remember that in this long lineup to get my passport done, that I was being able to just keep myself entertained just by my own thought process, right? In the sense that like, even if I feel kind of isolated and lonely, that there's something about also, you know, I have to admit, this is one of the reasons why I prefer not to take psychiatric medication, is that when I'm really heavily medicated, that I tend not to, it's like, there's some kind of thing where it's like, it kind of sedates my creative thought process. But when don't have that going on, there's something about like, at least the world seems like an interesting place, because I don't have any shortage of interesting things to think about, or things that inspire me, or that kind of stuff. But then I find that if I try to communicate that to the world, it takes on this quality of being like a bit too much. And there's this kind of thing that, like, in social circumstances, even if I might feel very, I have a lot of interesting things in my head, a lot of ideas, that you have to take this attitude of just like paying attention to what the sort of like social pecking order is. And most of the time this means that there's just like a lot of other people who are much more dominant socially, who just want to talk a whole bunch. And so there's this kind of thing about this, like, if you to socialize, it kind of goes back to this thing that Carl Jung said, right? Where like loneliness isn't just being surrounded by people, but rather like having like ideas that are interesting to you, that are exciting to you, but you have to like repress them and hold them back, because if you try to, if you are going to try to talk to people, you have to like really measure out a much more reduced version of these ideas to give to people, because it just seems like way too much. And I have to also admit that leading up to this, I've diverted from my usual pattern of recording videos maybe on a weekly basis, and I've started to record them like every day. And in the process of doing this, yesterday I had an idea. I was writing in my journal, and I had this idea that I was pretty excited about, but I was like, I'm not going to just do like 5 videos in a row. I should like wait and process things, or space it out a little bit, maybe develop the idea a bit more. And then, but as I was doing this, I started realizing that there's certain things that are interesting, but maybe not the best to talk about on my astrology channel. And part of the reason is because there are certain things which, again, going on this, it could be this, like, if you can't see anything nice, it's better not to see anything at all. It could also be that there are certain topics which are subject to shadow bans or censorship, where if you talk about certain things, then you will get deprioritized in the algorithm. And one of the things which is, maybe I'm sabotaging myself by just getting into it like this directly, but one of those things is indigenous issues. And I admit that maybe it's also a bit like unusual or less obvious to create a platform of talking about astrology and then using that to get into indigenous stuff, because obviously the astrology that I'm doing is tropical astrology based on ancient Greece. I mean, it's not that different from the Indian astrology, but this is basically all types of astrology which are foreign to the culture of the land that I'm on, right? It's like and there's something about the politics of indigenous people and their land, and also my own relationship with various indigenous people I've known in my life and stuff like that. And there's something about this where I've been thinking about it, but then I'm kind of like, wait a minute, is it going to do me any good to get into this stuff into my astrology videos, or would it be better for me to just like hold back on going into this stuff, right? That's just one example, anyways. The other thing too is that what I'm trying to say is that I have a number of YouTube channels, and I have a channel I wasn't doing astrology. I had a channel that was devoted more to like talking about things like psychiatry or anti-psychiatry or mental health or spiritual emergency, or also just talking about different books and stuff like that. But like that channel in which I'm doing that kind of stuff has very, very few followers and subscribers. And when I make, basically, I've been motivated. I've kind of migrated that kind of stuff off of YouTube to Substack, and I started a Substack blog where I'm writing about all kinds of things that, to give, and nothing to do directly really with astrology, but all kinds of things to write about that maybe feel more appropriate for a Substack blog than a YouTube channel. But to be very clear about it is that I have to admit that maybe I ended up uploading some things to that other channel that were maybe it's just like an overly dank sense of humor or something. I had this kind of like attitude to not really be that serious, I don't know. I don't even know if I really necessarily want to share that stuff here, but I was basically trying to make some multimedia collage stuff. Like, one of the things that I do is if I make music, then to try to like make music videos for the music that I make, or to try to make, instead of thinking about just making music videos for music, to make a kind of like multimedia art collage project. But when you do that, if doing that in this situation where the identity that I have is basically a mentally ill person who's making art that isn't very financially, it doesn't seem to have like the engine of productivity behind it. Like, I don't know if it's just that on its own, or if it's like the kind of audience basically, long story short, that it seems like if you are using YouTube and the kind of stuff you produce is like, if you're not producing the right stuff, it seems to like open the algorithmic gates of hell. And like, I just think there's some kind of ethical problem with this, in that like, I'm just gonna like very bluntly point out that like it's like when I'm on my astrology channel, the algorithmic feed has a certain kind of like pattern to what kind of videos that I'm being sent. And then in my least popular, if I try to make videos for my channel that's the least popular, that has the least number of followers, and if those videos aren't doing well, or that if I don't know, maybe I'm doing something that is just like, you know, I don't know what the actual mechanic is that causes this to happen, but the direction that I went with making videos for this other channel seemed to create a dynamic where the YouTube algorithm seemed like it was telling me to kill myself, or that the YouTube algorithm was sending like a thumbnail where it's like how to tie a noose to hang yourself, right? Or like stuff that's really like a lot of really dark shit, right? And it's kind of like, what does it like if you have the most popular video streaming platform, and you have a certain range. I mean, obviously there's certain things that you're not allowed to upload to YouTube that would violate the community standards, but within the whole range of creative possibilities of all the different things that you could make and call art, there seems to be this sort of force of subtle, I mean, or even not so subtle control and manipulation, where if you're doing things that they don't like, that they have no problem with having a whole like if you're like, especially which especially kind of strange to me is that if you legitimately have a mental health disability that would put you at greater risk for, let's say, suicidal ideation, the people who run these tech platforms seem to have no problem with sending videos to you that are going to trigger you into suicidal ideation, or promote, or push the most doom and gloom things. Or another example is that because maybe part of my history of trauma is that, at one point in time, I was mugged and I was stabbed. And the thing is, like, it seems to me that the algorithm probably is like, oh, because you maybe, like, let's say, had therapy and you talked to your therapist about your trauma about getting stabbed, we know that this is a sensitive issue for you. So if you want to control and manipulate you, we're just going to take all the news about people getting stabbed and people getting robbed and push that up to the top of your feed, right? And it's it's starting to become this thing where it's like, I feel like it's very obvious that to continue to make content for YouTube is like, maybe if you do the right thing, they reward you by sending you things that are more positive. But if you start making things that they don't like, they don't have any problem with trying to manipulate you into making you less mentally healthy, more unstable, sending you more triggering content. And I think that there's a really serious ethical problem to this, right? And I'm also, I don't know. This is basically, I don't know. I do think that there could be some, like, two sides of the coin, or maybe there is some wisdom to self-censorship and self-control and only talking about nice things and all this kind of stuff. But it feels more and more obvious that, like, we are like, you're using a platform that doesn't care about your well-being at all. And to the extent where if you have points of view or opinions or perspectives or inclinations to do things that are not approved of by the people who own the networks or own the power structure, that they will, it's like a war for your heart, your soul, war for your mind, war for your spirit, where they have no, it's run by basically a whole bunch of really corrupt people who have no problem of just degrading the mental health of everybody, of promoting the worst kind of content, and I have to admit that I'm making these astrology videos because it's my personal will to just keep going with this in spite of these kinds of problems. But I have to admit that I think it's important to have a certain degree of non-attachment to even things which I feel passionate about, such as doing astrology, in the sense that if it is really in my best interest to wrap up this project, to conclude what I'm doing here, to stop making astrology videos, or at least to stop making YouTube content, right? That I have to be open enough that even if for some reason I'm inclined to just keep doing this, that if it's really in my best interest to stop doing this, or to maybe stop trying to be a YouTuber, or to stop being a astrologer, or to stop being a content creator. I can't be too stubbornly holding on to this idea of continuing if it's something that just makes me less and less, that deteriorates my mental health, deteriorates my well-being, deteriorates my stability, or like has the effect of digging me deeper into some kind of hole without creating a positive, beneficial change on my life, right? And I think with Pluto, there's like, and there's like that kind of quality of being like is it like you there it could this test kind of thing, like, is it better, like, are you so stubborn not to quit even if it's against your best interest? Is it self-destructive to keep on doing this? Or like, is it like, is there some kind of like, is the irritation about what it brings up, is the irritation like provoking you to transform or make some kind of change or evolution or something like that, right? um and I think this also goes into the whole thing about what I was talking about with the idea of like Garmonbozia demons from Twin Peaks, or the idea of these like negative entities that like, I'm to just put it very bluntly, like, what if there something about like, in what if there are bad spirits of technology, right? This has actually been the um, theme of a many horror movies. For example, in The Ring, you have this haunted videotape where the girl is in the well, and it's like, people are like, the idea is that this is like some people are passing around this videotape that's said to have like secret powers, and like the girl crawls out of the screen kind of thing, right? Like, there's like, or there's also there's a Japanese horror movie I watched for the first time, I think last year, called Pulse, which is all about the like the early days of the internet, and like the feeling of being like haunted by the internet. And there's this kind of like, I have to admit, there's also this whole thing about like parasocial dynamics, right? And I think like part of the problem, I think, with internet and online social life is that parasocial dynamics are, there's something for me that is like inherently dissatisfying about it. And also inherently, like, there's also this kind of problem where I have to admit that most content creators, or most people that do things like podcasts or that kind of stuff, are really just don't suit my kind of personality. But then there's so much variety of stuff out there that eventually I find things that very much do suit my personality. But then it becomes like this kind of thing where it's like, I can only watch certain creators so much before I have to just, even if I really like what they do, I feel like it's like I'm becoming too personally intimate with some stranger who is just making media for mass consumption. And it's not like, it's this weird, there's a movie that's kind of like, have you guys heard of the anime movie Perfect Blue? It's like, if I don't want to become like some crazed, like the crazy fan of Perfect Blue, where it's like you have you're like, in the world of all these, podcasters or media personalities that I don't like, there's a few people who stand out as like superstars that I really admire, but then like it becomes like the narcissism of small differences, or that like you also admit that you're like, well, nobody, I have my own person, I'm not going to agree with everybody about anything, and or that, you know what I'm trying to say? That there's some kind of like, with Pluto, there is the risk of coming off like some sort of crazy stalker or something like that, right? And being somebody who's legitimately, my issue in life is that, like I was saying before, is that I do have a mental illness. I do feel socially frustrated. And for me, like this whole thing, what I'm trying to say is like, I've perhaps a kind of a psychological complex around this, where it's not really like, I'm not really that put off by the question of like natalism or having children or something like that. But I have to admit, as being an astrologer, it's like a very important part of astrology, because it's all like a birth chart is about being born, right? Like, and so there's some sort of fundamental thing where if you're reading birth charts, it's all about, your life and the beginning of your life, and reading the signs around the beginning of your life. And there's this kind of thing where just being a sensitive and intuitive person, I mean, I find that it's like without going into some big philosophical thing about it, like I might just pick up intuitive things like, oh, I can intuitively tell that people that are in my community are getting pregnant, right? People are getting married, people are having kids. And in this, maybe in this case, it's like, my sister is still friends with all the people that she was friends with growing up. And, I'm compared to her, I'm not friends with those people. I'm sure quite a number of those people that I used to be friends with have gotten married, have had kids. I don't know if that's the reason. Maybe they're too busy being married, having kids, and all this kind of stuff to socialize with me. Maybe that's not the reason, right? Maybe that they, there's some kind of issue though, where it's not really just the fact about, interpreting it as pressure to have children. I have to admit though, I did have it's kind of like maybe astrology is a weird thing to deal with, because, if you get your chart read, what happens if you're not really inclined to be like one of these really pronatalist birther types of people, and yet an astrologer looks at your chart and says, oh, it looks like you're going to have lots and lots of children. You're just going to be like a big daddy who's going to like have, lots, maybe you even have multiple marriages, and then there's this like existential pressure that you're like, why did this astrologer is giving me this expectation that I'm supposed to be like doing, but I'm like completely, have I, there's a Canadian musician called Matthew Good, who in his song Symbolistic White Walls has this line about seeing a fortune teller who's like, says my destiny is turning out all wrong, right? And there's this kind of thing of like, what's more likely? Is it, I actually, the kind of astrologers that the style of astrology that I was trained in, I was trained with a textbook done by Chris Brennan of the Astrology Podcast, and Chris Brennan and those guys say that the astrology is always right, and that if, that there's this, what's interesting about astrology is that regardless of whether you believe in it or not, from the perspective of a trained astrologer, even if you're a non-believer, that an astrologer could be able to look at your chart and the events of your life and put together the whole astrological dynamic and everything unfolding in perfect, beautiful harmony. Even if but there's this kind of thing about like the way that, astrologers themselves are infallible. And they may have when they're reading charts, they may think about things in a way that's kind of simplistic, or they may project upon you a certain standard of what the default adult life is like, being like, oh, just assuming you're like all the other adults, and this is what your chart looks like. This means that you're having lots and lots of babies, right? But if you take into the consideration that I don't know, there's plenty of bipolar people or plenty of mentally ill people who nonetheless go on to have lots of children. But, I don't know. What I'm basically trying to say is that because this stuff perhaps is not something that we talk about up front all the time, there's this kind of, Pluto, I feel, stands for this basic force of repression that keeps this stuff under the surface. And, if you can't see anything nice, don't see anything at all. And it's all for the sake of and yet there's something about all these things which we don't talk about existing under the surface, being like, it makes it incredibly difficult for me to collaborate and work with other people, because I find, perhaps due to my sensitivity and openness, I'm just kind of like easily triggered by this stuff, or perhaps I'm like, easily open to suggestion or something like that. And I think, so I don't know. I don't think it's not really the same as being like, I'm like triggered into a manic episode or anything like that, but triggered in the sense that like there is some, in order to just get by in everyday life, there are certain parts of me which are, frustrated or resentful or angry and upset that I just have to kind of censor out and repress. And I think that with our current situation, there's a lot of that force of censorship and repression could often have to do with, hierarchical forms of dominance and control, right? In the same way that the interests of those forces, especially with Aquarius being more of like the broader social, governmental, political level, like it could be like they have explicit interests to repress certain topics like the indigenous issues that I was talking about before, right? And there's this, when you factor in the thing about like Saturn and Neptune, there's an example of this. Like, I have to admit that at one point in time, I had a girlfriend who introduced me to like Buffy Sainte-Marie, and Buffy Sainte-Marie was a Canadian artist who recently was exposed as being basically a fake Indigenous person. Or like her whole shtick was that she was writing these like folk music songs that were all about like standing up for the Indigenous people or like the Indigenous perspective, but like she's actually just Italian, and that she apparently she was like adopted by an Indigenous community, and was like there's this kind of complicated dynamic where like sometimes people can join Indigenous communities even if they're not like Indigenous by blood or whatever. But there's something about this where it's like, I don't know, like this is probably, maybe I'm just sabotaging my algorithm by going into this, but there's like another issue around this, which if you factor in that this isn't just the Pluto opposition that I'm talking about, but the Saturn-Neptune opposition, there's this issue around purity politics, which isn't just like, there's purity politics in the sense of like liberal purity testing, in the sense that like, there's this dynamic where liberalism, political correctness or something like that, versus like cancel culture. If you say the wrong thing, then you're just deplatformed and you don't have or whatever, right? But there's this other dynamic with the issue of cancel culture and purity testing and all this kind of stuff, where like if you are, it's not just about like Buffy Sainte-Marie claiming to be an Indigenous person when really she's Italian, but like this issue about if Indigenous people get a benefit from the government for being Indigenous, right? If they have certain tax breaks or whatever, or they have certain financial benefits from having Indigenous or Indian, whatever you would say, status, there's this issue of like, what happens about Métis people that may only be half native or a quarter native or all this kind of stuff, and like to what extent are you becoming weird like racial purists about Indigenous benefits? Like what if you were going to say like the only people that are going to get an Indigenous benefit are the people that are 100% pure blood Indigenous Canadian, and that if you're Métis, if you have parents where one parent is Indigenous, one parent isn't, or that you're only a fraction Indigenous, they're like, so it's like this kind of thing where it's just like, it seems, you know what I'm trying to say? It's like there's this weird kind of thing where like I don't know how to describe this, because I think most common sense people would be like, oh yeah, Buffy Sainte-Marie, she was just profiting off of the Indigenous people by adopting their image and using it to make money or to build her career, rather than letting a authentic Indigenous person do that or whatever. But there's this other whole issue around like Indigenous purity testing, where like, what if isn't like you just have a bunch of people who are looking for any way possible to not pay pay out money to the oppressed and at-risk members of our society. And you might have a lot of people who are legitimately harmed by colonial trauma or colonial repression, but you're like, oh, well, we're only going to give it to all the purebred Indians. And, lucky for us, as time goes on, that number is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And, there'll only, sooner or later, there'll only be one or two or a few of these people that are like racially pure indigenous people left. And this is good news for us, because now we don't have to pay any money to anybody, and we don't have to, anybody who has any, your bargaining tool of saying like, oh, we are the, we have unsettled claim to this land. Well, oh, if you're only a third indigenous, no, you don't, right? Like, I think those kind of, like, I don't know. There's a lot of these kinds of dynamics that, I think, I've been recently watching Channel 5 News with Andrew Callahan, and he says that whenever he does a video that is specifically about these issues, about indigenous people and their claim to the land in the face of resource extraction, and there's this whole indigenous environmentalist movement where they feel that they're like protectors of the land, and that they're standing up to these sort of like greedy industrial colonizers who want to basically extract as much profit, and without as little care for the environment, or little care for taking care of the community or the land or the people that were here before them. It's like, and yet these kind of issues are basically censored or subject to repression at the hands of the algorithm. And then also, like, in the face of this, if you're not even getting into that stuff, but you're going to be an artist and you're going to like experiment with different kinds of art videos, and you're making it, like, the algorithm will literally just send you videos that looks like it's trying to, like, I've actually, like, the algorithm will literally send me things like a song, like there's a song called "Kill Yourself," right? Or something like it's like the algorithm is literally full of these, like, Garmin Bozia demons that, like, if you're not doing the right thing, they're going to punish you by basically, enacting psychological warfare. Like, you're already insecure. Like, oh, look, I don't have any friends to hang out with. I don't know if what I'm going to do is going to be popular or socially acceptable, but I'm taking the risk as an artist to make stuff, and then you put it out there, and then the algorithm is just like, you're a loser, kill yourself, hate yourself, nobody likes you, you're like, it's like, why on earth am I even like, I'm just going to say up front too, that I pay $15 a month for a YouTube algorithm, right? If I'm paying $15 a month to have a American-based tech platform tell me to kill myself, why the fuck am I continuing to pay for this, right? Why don't I just stop spending any money or spending any of my time and energy on any of these platforms that would do that? Like, what on earth makes me think that it's a good idea to either support or contribute my own labor energy to something that is explicitly toxic and harmful for me, or explicitly repressive of the indigenous members of the community? Like, it's there at some point in time. I'm going to have to, like, reevaluate whether it's really even, like, an alignment with my own principles and values and my own sense of ethical, moral standards to continue operating on these kinds of platforms, which are clearly, should be just explicitly seen for what they are, as a kind of toxic, harmful, addictive substance that's filled with all kinds of negative energy, and is like, maybe just trying to be a content creator is a form of self-destructive behavior, right? This is basically, I think, for me anyways, I think that this whole Mercury retrograde process in particular, with its aspects to these outer planets such as Pluto, Saturn and Neptune and Aries, and eventually this Uranus and Gemini, these are some things that are going to be on my mind as we go through this Mercury retrograde, and maybe there will be a revision of how I'm choosing to interact on these platforms, or if it's in my best interest to use these platforms at all. Okay? So, thanks for watching. Thanks for considering everything I've said. Stay tuned for more. I have more ideas in the pipeline on the way.